Hey, welcome back. Business 101. And we are now in week number, or at least on module number 7. And so I wanted to give you a little brief introduction to that. But I also want to mention a couple things, just a few minor housekeeping issues. And that is that at this point, we have about halfway, almost halfway through the semester, right? You've finished midterm number 1. And you should be able to tell from taking a little bit of time in Grade Center sort of where you are in this class. And I just want to invite you to do that this week, to take a good hard look at Grade Center when you have a chance, maybe today at lunchtime, or when you got a little bit of time to sort of review what I've got posted in Grade Center for you. Now that we're almost at the halfway mark, this is the perfect opportunity to sort of take a barometer and see, well, how are my results and outcomes in this class? And am I generally on pace to earn the grade, the outcome that I'm looking to get at the end of the semester? And the reason I encourage you to do that, I think it's always a good thing in college to be periodically checking up on yourself and taking some time to reflect and say, look, with the amount of work I'm putting into this class and the time I'm spending studying and reviewing my notes and those kinds of things, is it really sufficient for what I want to earn in this class? And many of you in this class are going to be able to look at Grade Center and say, yeah, I am totally on track for the outcome I'm looking for in this class, whether that's an A or whatever grade you're hoping to earn in this. And I realize also that occasionally a student may look at Grade Center and say, you know what, I'm not entirely pleased based on what I expected to get in this class and what I'm seeing in Grade Center. What can I do about this? And so what I want to encourage you to do is always, if there are any questions, if you are looking at sort of results versus what your expectations were and there's a little bit of a disconnect, get a hold of me, email me, we can figure out a way for us to chat either over email or on a Zoom call or during office hours. But now is the time that we're, just sort of around the halfway point and finished up midterm 1, to take stock of where you're at and to see if there is something that we can chat about if your expectations and your outcomes aren't really aligned. If there's a way that you want to change something you're doing to get a better outcome than where perhaps Grade Center may be pointing, this is the time to do it. Alrighty, so I just wanted to leave that brief encouragement to you to sort of take stock where you're at, make sure you're on the path you want to be on here in this class for the rest of the course. Alrighty, now turning our attention then to Module 7, right? We are now dealing with Module 7 in this class, and as you can see, the title of this module is Operations. And so the first thing we need to tell you, operations is synonymous in this class, really in this discipline of studying business. When you see the word operations, what we're really talking about is production, all right? Obviously, we're not talking about that strange little game that we used to have as children. Remember Operation, that game with the little, the tweezers, and you had to pull bones out of a patient whose eyes were open and awake. It was always the creepiest thing to me, right? No, we're talking about not operation, but we're talking about production. How do you actually end up producing the product or service you're going to be delivering to your customers, right? And so there are some things, whether we're talking about hard products, physical products, or whether we're talking about services, there are some things that are unanimous when we think about that. And that's how this module starts out, is conceptually introducing the whole concept of utility and value. So you'll want to spend some time studying that in the textbook and the video lectures on this. The whole idea that no matter what we're talking about, if you are offering something for sale, generally speaking, your customer doesn't purchase unless you are delivering a sufficient amount of utility or value. In some way, those terms are somewhat synonymous, right? Are you delivering sufficient value that the customer thinks to himself, I'm getting this amount of value for this amount of price, this makes it worth me purchasing it, right? That generally speaking, in the perception of the consumer, there needs to be a abundance of value over price in order to make it a good buy. Because if, frankly, I'm asked to pay this much, but I'm only getting this much value, I'm better off keeping the money in my pocket, right? For instance, nobody wants to buy a hamburger for $900, right? We don't, no matter how hungry you are, we don't really see the value of a hamburger exceeding that much money, right? We have a situation like this, you're better off keeping the money in your pocket and finding an alternative, right, to meet that particular need. The same is true here. And so when we talk about the concept of utility and value, the reason we do that is so that when we think about operations or production, in what ways is production or operations creating and delivering an abundance of utility? And there are different ways that utility takes shape. The module will introduce you to at least 3 different types of utility. Okay, so here's a type of utility. Form utility. The transformation of inputs into an output, a form that is immediately useful to the consumer. Right? I'll give you an example. This is my iPhone. There are many like it, but this one is mine. That is a reference to the movie Full Metal Jacket, for those of you who may be Stanley Kubrick fans. Nevertheless, right, the common iPhone, right? Why did I buy this iPhone? Well, because it has converted the raw inputs, electronic components, circuit boards, a screen, etc., right? It has converted the inputs into a form that is immediately useful to me when I take it out of the box. What does this mean? It means if you stuck me in a room with some electronic tools and a whole bunch of components, I would never be able to create an iPhone on my own. I don't have the expertise, and therefore the expertise that takes those raw inputs and converts it into a phone I can use, that's worth something to me, that has value to me. The utility creates value. Form utility. All right, that's one form of utility. Another form or type of utility is time utility. And this, of course, you can easily see, for instance, in the service Netflix, right? How many of us have Netflix accounts? During this pandemic, if you didn't have one, you got one now, right? And you may be binge watching a show. My wife and I have gotten ourselves binge watching Ted Lasso. We love that show. There are other quality shows out there. You know what I'm talking about. What is one of the forms of utility that Netflix delivers? Time utility. What does that mean? It means you can watch the show when you want, right? Used to be when we only had cable television, if you had a show you wanted to watch, you got to watch it when it comes on, right? The only shown on Tuesdays at 8 o'clock, you got to juggle your nighttime schedule to sit down in front of the TV on Tuesdays at 8 o'clock. Well, with Netflix, it's whenever you want. And so the ability to be flexible in time schedule to allow the customer to enjoy the product or service when it's convenient for the consumer, that delivers a form of time utility that has value, right? It has utility. It has value to me that I'm willing to pay for, right? So that's a second form of utility, right? Form utility and time utility. The third is place utility. Place utility, which can be defined as allowing the customer producing your product or service in such a way that the customer can enjoy it wherever they want, or with greater flexibility in terms of where they want to enjoy it. Here's an example. How many of us here in the Bay Area have ever taken a BART train? Okay, I have many times. I used to be a BART warrior. Okay, if you want to catch a BART train, where do you have to go? If you want to catch a BART train, you want to ride a BART train, where do you have to go? The answer is obvious, to a BART station. Yes, sometimes the math is as simple as that in this class. Okay, but let me contrast that with another form of transportation. If you want to catch an Uber or a Lyft, where do you have to go? This is an example of place utility, because the answer to that question, right, the answer to that riddle is you just have to walk out to the curb, right? I mean, you have to call it on your phone, but after that, you just walk out to the curb and bang, in a couple of minutes, there is your Uber or your Lyft car ready to pick you up. Greater flexibility in terms of where you can enjoy the service than, for instance, a BART train or a typical city bus where you have to go to the bus station or a BART station. That makes sense? Okay, so those are at least a couple of forms of utility. It's not intended to be comprehensive, just three primary examples: form utility, time utility, place utility, so that we can begin to think, in what ways does production or operations add or increase utility to the inputs to make it more attractive to a consumer to make a purchase decision, right? So that's, a consideration, the ways in which you create utility, you add value. Now, another consideration when we talk about operations or production is that there is a significant difference between producing products and producing services, right? So if you think about it, right, with products, when you produce products, you can just build a bunch of them, stick them in the shelf, right? Put them in inventory, put them in the storeroom. Not so much with services, right? Many of you in this class, perhaps at one point in your life or another, you have gotten a massage or you've gotten a haircut, right? Those are services which cannot be built prior and then stored in inventory. You can't buy a haircut and have it delivered by Amazon, right? You can't have a box of massages that you store up, right? They have to be delivered to the customer when the customer is there, is present, and quite frankly, is actively engaged in the delivery of the service, right? I mean, that's the thing, is that every time I've ever gotten a haircut, I had to be there sitting in the chair so that the stylist can cut my hair, right? You can't create these things beforehand, store them in boxes, right? And therefore, there are some differences that we're going to ask you to consider in delivering products versus delivering services to customers that you have to be mindful of, right? What else will you see in this module? You'll see a discussion of how strategy in the marketplace determines operational decisions. And this is a big concept that, quite frankly, some students have a little trouble getting their arms around. And essentially, the whole discussion revolves around the fact that companies make strategic decisions how we want to position our company in the marketplace. What does that mean? Well, for instance, when we think about the automobile manufacturer Toyota, currently the number one auto manufacturer in the world, right? When you think about buying a Toyota, what are you thinking about? Well, you're thinking about buying a reliable vehicle that doesn't break down very often, and when it does, it doesn't cost a ton to get it fixed. I mean, relative to other car brands, right? And so you should know that, for instance, annually when the surveys came out, every year Toyota is the most economical, the least expensive brand to own in terms of overall cost of ownership, things like repairs and maintenance and those kinds of things, right? There are far more expensive brands to own than Toyota, which tends to be a relatively reliable car. In fact, statistically, the most reliable car brand that you can buy in the United States. Now, why does that happen? It's because Toyota deliberately and intentionally decided their strategic positioning in the marketplace, we want to be known for building reliable cars. Cars with the quality of reliability and therefore a low overall cost of ownership. And if that's your strategic positioning, that will it will dictate how you make decisions about a lot of things in operations, in production. It will dictate how you train up people to build your cars, how you structure your assembly lines, who you select and what criteria you use to select, for instance, suppliers who will sell you your inputs, right? All of these things are then dictated by what? By the strategic positioning in the marketplace that you as a company choose. I mean, contrast that, for instance, with another automobile manufacturer, Rolls-Royce, right? Rolls-Royce, their automobiles are far more luxurious than a Toyota, quite frankly, right? And you have different considerations if you're building Rolls-Royce in terms of prestige, exclusivity, luxury, how quiet is the car, how smooth is the ride, what does it feel like to, well, frankly, to ride in the back seat, because many owners of Rolls-Royces don't drive them. They have a driver to do that for them. They ride in the back, right? And so what is the experience riding in a Rolls-Royce versus a Toyota? Now, obviously, a Rolls-Royce has a much higher cost of ownership, overall cost of ownership, than a Toyota. But because of that strategic decision, how Rolls-Royce wants to position themselves in the marketplace, that will have different production and operations decisions than if you're building Toyotas. I hope that makes sense. So there's a big concept in this module you'll tackle in the text as well as in the video micro lectures. Now, from there, one of the other big concepts I want to talk about, at least in this introduction to the module, is the whole idea of different ways of physically laying out your manufacturing, your production, your operations. And we give you two major flavors. One is what we call the process layout. The process layout is sometimes known as departmental layout. So for instance, if you come to campus, to the College of Marin, and you show up because you want to get your transcripts, where do you go? You physically go to the building that holds the registrar's office, right? Versus if you wanted to talk to, for instance, financial aid. Financial aid, well, that's a different department. It might be in an entirely different building on campus. You have to walk to another part of campus to go to the financial aid office. Versus if you came to campus to go to your class, when we resume physical classes, you'll go to a completely different building where your classroom is, right? This is known as a process layout, where physically you move the departments around for a more customized experience, depending on what the customer needs. This is significantly different than, for instance, what we call the product layout, which is a lot like, well, for instance, if you've ever gotten food at Chipotle. If you go to Chipotle, it's a lot like an assembly line, right? Everybody starts at the same starting point. The guy asks you, do you want a burrito or a bowl? And what kind of meat? Okay, then after that, what happens? After you make that decision, your product is moved to the next station in the assembly line. They ask you, what kind of add-ons, what kind of beans do you want? Do you want rice? And, right? And then it goes to the next station where they ask you what kind of vegetables or what kind of salsa, and then you are moving like your product, right? The burrito is moving down the assembly line station by station, right? And this is the way that many items are mass produced in an assembly line. This is how automobiles are mass produced. This is how your burrito is mass produced. This is how a lot of items, right? When you talk about needing to make a large quantity of identical products, many times companies choose to use an assembly line process, right? So you have the product layout and the process layout. That's a big concept in this module. And you'll see some other discussions about production and operations, how built into the production cycle is the level of quality that you're going to get in your products, right? If you are promising your consumers a very, very high level of quality, you will have certain things you need to put in place in operations, right? Another discussion, the tail end of our module, you'll see a discussion about supply chain. And of course, right now, in this particular climate we have some global supply chain issues that affect a number of different industries. I believe the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see some very large changes in the way that big multinational corporations do international supply chain because of some of the consequences of our supply chain struggles we're going through right now. You'll see that discussed in this module as well. Anyway, this is the kind of thing that you're going to see in Module 7 now, a discussion about production and operations that introduces some crucial considerations that any any person in business, if you are going to end up to be a business major, a businesswoman, or a businessman, things that you have to consider no matter where you work. If you are a decision maker in your company, some of the decisions about operations will end up crossing your desk. Things you have to consider, things you have to make some pretty far-reaching decisions that'll have some real consequences, both positive and perhaps not so positive, depending on how you choose to structure and maintain operations. Alrighty, so that is our introduction to module number 7. I hope this is useful. The module is now open. I invite you to take a good hard look. And as always, if you have any questions or comments on this stuff, don't hesitate to get a hold of me. Would love to chat with you at any time. Alrighty, take care, and we will see you in the next module.